Okay, so let's jump into this project. This project is going to be a sewing project, but first we're going to learn a little bit about quilting specifically in this Appalachia region. So for our vocabulary, we have color. Color is the light reflected off of objects that make us perceive it in a certain way. But for our focus, we're going to talk about how color makes us feel or what color means to us. We're going to tell a story with color. Our second one is pattern. We'll be talking about pattern in two different ways. One is the pattern that is on the fabric, like the flowers that are on some of these pieces right now on the PowerPoint. But we'll also be talking about pattern in the sake of multiple pieces of fabric coming together to make one quilt square. So there is a pattern involved. We'll talk about pattern there. And then we'll be talking about running stitch. A running stitch is the type of stitch we're going to use to sew our fabric together. So where did the Appalachian style of quilting come from? We obviously didn't invent quilting. You can go all the way back to Egyptians. It's been around for a long time. We've needed blankets. We've needed to stay warm. So we took a lot of different inspirations, people from Europe, Native Americans, Amish, all kinds of different communities. And we took some of their little things from here and there, and we put them into one style of quilting that we have now. And although we didn't start quilting, we didn't invent it, it is deeply rooted in our history. I'm sure we all know someone who quilts. It's very popular here. It's tradition. So why do we quilt? Originally, we quilted to stay warm. We have to be warm for survival. People would talk, they lived in uninsulated houses, so it was very cold. They might wake up with snow on their blankets. They needed good blankets. So we did it out of necessity. But it also has become an art. It's also to tell a story. It tells a story about who made it. It may even have imagery that literally tells a story when you look at it. One of the examples of quilting with a purpose and with a storytelling is that Appalachian Americans were very poor. So during slavery, they kind of had this relation with those that are enslaved. They felt for them. And although we are thought of being very South, we didn't. A lot of the Appalachian region supported the North. And they auctioned off these blankets that they would make for the cause, and they would auction them off in support of the abolitionists. So how do quilts tell a story? We can tell a story with the fabric. Maybe it was your entire family's clothes that put it together, and you have your dad's work pants and, your mom's dress shirt, her church clothes. You can tell a whole story by the way of all the fabrics that are used, but also the color, the styles, the quilt squares themselves tell stories and have meanings. Some quilts do have imagery, but not all do, and it's not necessary to tell the story. So quilt squares. A quilt is made up of many quilt squares, and they each have a meaning and tell a story too. You've likely seen a lot of these patterns that I'm about to talk about in your own home. So the first one's the log cabin. This one symbolized home and warmth. The middle part was supposed to be like the hearth, the fireplace in the center. You get a crazy quilt. This one was common around here because it was just taking whatever scrap you had and putting it together however it worked, because you didn't have big pieces of fabric. So you just pieced it together. And you can see here they've done some stitching like embroidery, and they've kind of told their story through there too with different imagery. This is another really popular one from this region in Appalachia, is Grandma's Flower Garden. And it really came about during the Great Depression because you didn't have big pieces of fabric. You had to work with small ones. So working with those small pieces, they can make them into little hexagons and then piece them together into this flower pattern. Another quilt square is a double wedding ring. A lot of you have probably saw this one. It's very popular to give as a wedding gift when people get married. It represents love and marriage. And then an 8-pointed star. This one has religious background to where with Christianity and stars guiding people, and they use it as a sign of faith. And now who made these quilts? We have all these quilts, and who are making them? It's usually the women and the girls. They would quilt in their home and teach their daughters. And these daughters were as young as 3 and 4 that were learning to quilt. At 5 years old, they could piece together a quilt square and actually help make the quilt, but they started learning at 3 or 4. And there also women did quilting circles where a bunch of women came together all at one house to work on one quilt together. And this furthers that storytelling of quilts. They would sit around quilt and share stories together. So what will our quilt look like? Our quilt's going to look kind of like the one on the screen right now. We're each going to sew together 4 blocks to make one square. And our finished one's going to resemble this one. Now, what story will our quilt tell? Our story is going to tell your story. When you pick your 4 pieces out, I want you to pick pieces that tell us something about you. Maybe your favorite color, maybe if you have pets, maybe a hobby that you have. Anything you can think of to tell us about you, let's tell us about it. It doesn't have to be obvious. As long as you can explain to me how that piece of fabric says something about you, it's fine. That's all it has to do. It doesn't have to be obvious. Now, this is really important. This is our needle safety. We're going to be using needles. So we do not poke anything or anyone with the needles. They're only for our fabric. We also do not leave our seat with the needle. We stay in our seat. They'll be given to us at our seat, and then they will be taken up when you raise your hand to give yours back. We do not need to be up with the needles. If you no longer need it, as soon as you're done, you raise your hand for me to come collect it. If we're not using it, we don't need it. It's going to get lost, and we don't want to lose our needles. And also, we work slowly and carefully to avoid poking ourselves. Now let's get started.
For your project, you will have 4 different squares. Your squares are going to be different colors and different patterns and things that you can use to tell us the story about yourself. Mine are white, that way you can see my stitching and really see what I'm doing for the demonstration. We're going to start off with having a needle and having some thread. We're going to take our thread, one long piece of thread, and we're going to fold it in half. And we're going to have both of the ends up here together. We're going to take both those ends and thread them through the little eye on our needle. You're going to pull it through a little bit, that way you don't lose it when you go to stitching, but you'll have a loop at the bottom. So to start, we're going to pick 2 squares and put them together. When you have a pattern, you want the patterns to face each other. So you want the backs of the fabrics on the outside. To start, we're going to go to one of the corners. We're going to go through our fabric, but don't pull it all the way through. You want to come back through the other side. After you come back through the other side, you're going to want to take it through your loop. And this is to make our knot at the end, that way we don't pull it out. Now we're going to do a running stitch down the side of our fabric. And this is just going in one side, and you go in one side, and you come right back out the other side. We want to try to keep it in a straight line. Now, a quicker way to do this, if you can keep it neat, is you can go in and back out, but you got to make sure you're going through both pieces of fabric. And this is going to make your running stitch. So we're going to do that all the way down this side of your fabric. Just one side. When we get it done, we'll have one stitch down one side, and when we open it up, they're going to be connected. To finish this off, you're going to go back through, and you go back and forth a couple times in the same spot, not the exact same hole, but in that same little spot, so it's less likely to come apart. And then we're going to tie a knot. You see how I held the knot down at the bottom? We don't want it up here at the top. All right, so now we're gonna cut our thread. You'll have scissors. And we have 2 pieces together.
You're gonna do this process twice.
We're gonna get our 2 pieces of fabric. You want the sides that you can't see the stitching. You want to put them together. You want to line them up real nice so that your 2 stitches are going to make a relatively straight line. And we're going to stitch on one side. So once again, you're going to start in the corner, go in and out, go through your loop, it's going to make your knot, and then you want to do your running stitch down the side of the fabric again. Same thing we did when it was just the 2 squares. Same thing we did when it was just the 2 squares, only this time we're gonna go all the way down the length of them. When we get to here, we're just gonna sew right over our 2 previous ones. And then we have all 4 squares sewn together, and that's your finished quilt square.